A compound inequality has two or more inequalities that come together. For example, I could have two inequalities that come together with the word and whatever solution is true for one, it has to be true for the other one as well, so it has to work for both of them. Solution must work for both, whatever x values you find. Or you could have two inequalities that are joined by an or, and in this case, solution must work for at least one. So when I say solution, I mean really the x value that you find. Because if it's a solution, that automatically satisfies both, in this case, one and this case. So the x values must work for both of these, whichever ones you find. And for an or statement, the x values must work either for this one, or maybe both. And then this is known as a three-part inequality, which is really also an and inequality in disguise, because it really says that 2x plus 1 is greater or equal to negative 2, and at the same time 2x plus 1 is less than 4 as well. So the three-part inequality is really an and problem squished into one together. So an example, it says graph the solution and give it in interval notation. So we want to graph it on the real line, x is less than 2, and at the same time x also has to be greater than negative 1. So we have our real line on the right side, and the first piece says x has to be less than 2. So I'm going to go stand at 2, which is right here, and since it says x has to be less than 2, it must be all the stuff to the left of 2. And since it says less than 2 and there is no equal sign with it, we're going to use parentheses to indicate that 2 itself is not part of the solution. Everything to the left of 2 works. So again, if there is no equal sign, 2 itself is not part of the solution, and we use parentheses. The second one says x has to be greater than or equal to negative 1. So I go to negative 1 and I stand there, and since it says x is greater than, it must be everything to the right, and it says x is greater than or equal to negative 1. So negative 1 also gets satisfied and is part of the solution, and I make a bracket. So bracket means inclusive, the negative 1 is also part of my solution, and no bracket means parentheses, leave it open. It's similar to an open hole and filled in hole that you remember from before probably. Now look at that, it says this has to get satisfied and this other piece, so my overall solution is really whatever place they overlap. So the overlap is the solution for an and problem. So here's a graph of the solution. It's between negative 1 and 2 because that's the only place where they overlap. And in interval notation, which is a new item we're learning, interval notation basically means walk left to right and grab wherever your x value or solution starts and wherever it stops. So if I'm walking left to right and just following the graph, it starts at negative 1, comma, it stops at 2. And then I use the appropriate notation from here. Negative 1 is included as part of my solution and 2 is not, so I leave it open with parentheses. So interval notation just basically says, where do you start, comma, where do you stop? And if we have equal signs, remember we use brackets because the solution really includes that number as well. And if I don't have any equal signs, we use parentheses because that number itself is not part of the solution. Okay, let's look at the next example, which says graph the solution, of course, on the real line again, and give it in interval notation as well. So this says x is greater than 2 or is the key word, x is less than or equal to negative 1. So for the first piece, we're going to go stand at 2, and it says x is greater than 2. So it must be everything to the right of 2, that's the solution for that piece. And since it's greater than with no equal sign, I have to use parentheses because 2 is not part of the solution. It's just where things begin. The next one says x is less than or equal to -1. So I stand at -1 right here, and since it says x is less than or equal to, x must be to the left at that point. So everything to the left, and because of the equal sign, -1 is included, so I use brackets. Now since this problem says or, and there's clearly no overlap, if this were an and problem there would be no solution because there's no overlap, it basically says either the solution is here or the solution is here, so both pieces qualify for my solution. So my solution finally here in red is everything to the left of -1 qualifies, and also everything to the right of 2 qualifies because the solution could be either here or here. I have a choice either here or here. Now in interval notation, remember I'm just walking left to right, so if I'm walking left to right, I'm coming all the way from back here, which is -infinity, all the way back here. And then I keep coming, and then I stop right here, which is -1. Bracket is where I stop. -infinity, always with plus or minus infinity, you're going to use parentheses because technically you never really reach it. So -infinity is where it supposedly quote-unquote starts, -1 where it stops, and then I start again the other piece at 2 with parentheses because 2 is not included in my solution. And then I keep going forever and ever to the right, so I go all the way to infinity, and again parentheses always with infinity. And in between them we use this union sign that says the solution could either be here or here. So graph the solution again, give it an interval notation. This is a 3-part inequality, and these are actually the easiest ones to graph because they basically tell you x is trapped between -2 and 5. 5 included, -2 not included. So my solution basically starts at -2, parentheses, because it's not included, there's no equal sign, and it stops at 5 with 5 included, so I'm going to make a bracket there, and everything in between is where x lies, so x is trapped between -2 and 5. And in interval notation, just follow exactly the graph. You start at -2, comma, you stop at 5 as you're walking left to right on the graph, and -2 is not included, parentheses, and 5 is, because of this equal sign, included as part of the solution. So this really involves little analysis where you just trap x between the two values and then you give it in interval notation as well.